Let's start. Let's just take a moment and consider God's presence with us here tonight. Heavenly Father, thank you for the opportunity to gather in your name. Thank you for the meal that we just had, but also thank you for so many students showing up tonight and for being here wanting to learn more about your saints. We ask that you send St. Francis Xavier to us tonight to help us to learn more about his life and why it's important to us. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. So if, and apologize at the beginning if I happen to say Francis Xavier Cabrini, that's an accident. That's one of my favorite saints. She took her name after St. Francis Xavier. And so sometimes it just rolls off my tongue with a Cabrini at the end. So if I say that, I'm misspeaking at that time. But we'll talk about St. Francis. This was kind of a tough one to prepare, and I don't know why. It just kind of was. He's a pretty important saint. He's actually one of the first significant missionaries, Christian missionaries in the 1500s. He spread a lot of Christianity. He helped undo some of the damage that was done by people that had already started exploring and then had gone out and started doing bad things. So he was trying to kind of do damage control on some of that. So he's really important from that. And because of his efforts, he's become one of the patron saints of foreign missionaries. And so he's a pretty important guy. He was born, I'm going to start here. He was born in 1506, so quite a while ago, a little over 500 years ago. And he was born in what is now northern Spain. He was in the Navarre region. So his primary language was Basque. So there's that area in northern Spain. He was from Pamplona, which if you ever get the chance to go on the Camino, which is what I hope to do in a couple of years, you go right through Pamplona. And so they had like these little, I don't want to say kingdoms, but it was kind of like these little estates. And so there was a lot of different families, and they would have a castle, and sometimes they would fight with each other and stuff like that. So if you remember, we talked about St. Ignatius of Loyola. He was from the same area. He's going to be prominent in our story again tonight. He was from the same area, and their families actually were at odds. They weren't like warring against each other, but they didn't get along, and sometimes they'd fight. St. Francis, he was maybe about 10 or 12 years younger than St. Ignatius. So anyway, so he grew up, they had money, they had an estate, and so he had kind of a, I guess, normal childhood for being in the 1500s. But he definitely came from money, so he had lots of good things, lots of nice clothes, got a good education, which at the time was definitely not common unless you had money. And so when he was about 19 years old, they sent him off to Paris to go to the university. And so he heads off to Paris at about age 19. And while he's there, he meets a gentleman by the name of Peter Favre, and they're roommates. And Peter's a future saint. Sometimes you'll see Peter Faber, but he spells his name Favre, just like Brett Favre, F-A-V-R-E. And so they became roommates, and they really hit it off. They were both Catholic, and so at that time, if you're a Catholic, you did all the Catholic stuff. That really wasn't like you were rebelling a lot. And after a couple of years, this other guy shows up, and he becomes friends with Peter. His name is Ignatius. It's Ignatius of Loyola, and he was a bit older. And if you kind of remember his story, he, was kind of a wild guy. He was a soldier. He was into dueling and sword fighting, and he had been injured in a battle when a cannonball shattered his leg. And after a series of life-changing events, and the only thing that it was available for him to read was the Life of Christ and the Lives of the Saints, were the two books that he could get, that anybody could find for him. He had a profound conversion experience. And, I won't go into his story that much, but he winds up going to Paris. Somebody funds his education because he had given up everything that he had, and he became a beggar on purpose so that he could, purify himself of everything of all of his worldliness. So someone pays for his education and sends him off to the University of Paris, which is very fortuitous because he had already started gaining a following where he was. This is Ignatius. And when he went to Paris, there were people, he was very charismatic, and people sort of gathered around him as well. And two of those guys were Francis and Peter. And so, Peter really kind of gravitated towards Ignatius really quickly because Peter felt a calling to the priesthood. And Ignatius was there to work on his theology. He was already had started kind of a group of people. It really wasn't an order of brothers or monks, but that's what it was kind of turning into. But it had no official recognition. And so he was there to get his theology degree so that he could do more with it. And so him and Peter really hit it off, and Francis did too, but right away Ignatius started trying to convince Francis. He said, "You should be a priest." And Francis was like, "No," he says, I'm gonna get my degree, and I've got all these big plans. I'm gonna be in business. I'm gonna do all this kind of stuff." And Ignatius goes, "You're gonna be a priest?" He's like, "No, I'm not gonna be a priest." And this went on for a couple of years. I mean, they weren't like arguing, they weren't violently arguing, but it was just a difference of opinion. But they still liked each other a lot, and they really became close, almost like brothers. And so after a time, it's not. It's one of those things that it may be a legend, but it says that one of the things that might have changed Francis's heart is that Ignatius asked him the question. He says, "What would it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul?" Some theologians say that actually happened. Some say it didn't. Regardless, there came a point in time when Francis had been convinced by Ignatius that he did need to enter the priesthood, and so he had already gotten a couple of degrees already at this St. Barbara College, and they really again started their group started gaining momentum. And in addition to those three, there was four other guys until there was these 7 guys, and they were all doing this. And in 1534, they took an oath of fidelity and an oath of to poverty, chastity, and obedience, and a undying devotion to the Pope. And so, through a series of events, they were ordained at various points in there. Through a series of events in 1540, they wind up going to Rome to present the rules for the order. They basically said, we want this to become an official thing. People saw all the good works they were doing. They were literally doing things like just going into hospitals and just helping. And they were cleaning out, they were cleaning out victims' wounds. And they were working in hospices. And they were, there was a point where Ignatius was doing this, and he showed by example. He would go out and beg and then give the money to other poor people, which was kind of like, when people saw this, they're like, that's really weird. Usually you go beg and then you use it for yourself. But that's what he would do. And so that's what they would do. And so this thing just kind of started gaining momentum. And it was approved by the Pope, and I think it was 1540, 1541. And they were called the Society of Jesus. And so that still lives on today. If you see a priest name and has S.J. behind their name, that's what that is. They're also known as the Jesuits. Marquette University in Milwaukee is a Jesuit university. Okay, there's at least a big presence there of them. That's a lot of what they do. And so they became, for their work, they want to do whatever the Pope says needs to be done. And he says, we really need missionaries. They're like, okay, we'll be missionaries. And so they said the King of Portugal had requested some people to go out and become missionaries, as I mentioned earlier, to kind of clean up some of the damage that had been done by their explorers. And so what would happen is Portugal was a big colonial power in the early 1500s, and they had gone out and they had gone into places in Africa, they had gone to places in India, places in Southeast Asia, and they had gone out and they had started to colonize these places because these are places that had natural resources. And so they wanted to go out there so that they could basically make their country richer. So not always the most savory individuals were ones that went out. And so, the hope was that they were gonna, act like, gentlemen, but they didn't. And so there was a lot of things that, and this is one of the things that sometimes gives Catholics a bad name. People say, well, look at all the bad stuff that Catholics have done in the name of Christianity. These guys weren't acting in the name of Christianity. They were acting in their own names, and they did a lot of horrible things. And so they wanted to get some really solid missionaries to go out and kind of basically straighten things up, re-evangelize the areas. And so they sent 2 Jesuits, 2 of them to Portugal. I think it was, maybe they sent all 3 of them. But anyway, they sent 2, and for whatever reason, neither one of them wanted being able to go. One of them got sick, and one of them they wanted him to do something else in Lisbon. And so the next one that was in line to go was Francis. And I think the reason that he wasn't picked first wasn't because he wasn't the most qualified, but like I said earlier, he and Ignatius were very close, like brothers. And Ignatius, loved him so much, loved him in a brotherly way, that he knew that if he sent him off to be a missionary, he was never going to see him again. And that really broke him up. And but he knew that it was time to kind of let him go. And so he sends him to Portugal, and he gets on a ship and he starts sailing. And it took him over a year to get from Portugal all the way around southern Africa. They wintered over in Mozambique. By the time they got up to the west coast of India, it had been 13 months. I think they were actually only on the ship for like 7 of those months. I think they were in Mozambique for 5 or 6. But it took them a lot longer than it normally takes for whatever reason. It didn't really give much explanation as to why they spent so much time in Mozambique. But anyway, he gets there to a place called Goa, G-O-A. And immediately he can see, this isn't going the way that they originally planned it to go. And so Francis, he had kind of a charisma about him as well. People really liked him. It was just like he had a natural magnetism towards people just kind of liking him. And so, he said, he didn't go right away after the people who were doing all the Portuguese who were doing all the bad stuff. He kind of said, I'm going to educate the children and some of the people in the hospitals, and we're going to start there. And so what he would do is he would walk through the town and he would ring this bell, and the kids would follow, and then he would teach them their catechism, and they would come to Christ. Because what happened is that the people that had gone there were Catholic, and occasionally, there was like one bishop and a couple of priests, but nothing outside of Goa. Some of the people had been baptized, but they'd been baptized but not catechized. So it's like they kind of accepted the faith, but they didn't know what they were accepting. And so it was like, okay, you're saved, but they couldn't do anything with it really. And so he starts with the children and basically kind of like, I'm going to evangelize the kids, and then they're going to help evangelize others, including their parents, including the other people in the area. And this works, okay? And so there's other people, there's times when, some of these people who were there to make money and not to be Catholic, they would get in his face and they would cause problems for him. And there was times when they like burned down his hut, and things like that. They were trying to get rid of him, but he prevailed in the end. And these places, he was just baptizing people right and left. In fact, they said some of the estimates are he baptized tens of thousands of people. One thing said that in 1 month he baptized like 5,000 to 10,000 people. I mean, who knows, right? Sometimes these numbers get inflated with history, but he baptized a lot of people. They said sometimes he was so sore from baptizing, he couldn't even raise his arms at the end of the day because he was baptizing so many people. And so he starts, there starts being needs further south, south of Goa, down on the coast there. And if I've got a map, you'll never be able to see it, but if you guys know anything about some of the early explorations, they had possessions along the coast because that's what they could reach by ship. And oftentimes they didn't go too far inland because who knows what was inland. They didn't want to go in there too much, but they would get whatever resources they could get on the coast. And so he kind of works his way down the coast of India, all the way down to the tip. So if you know your geography, Goa is about, if you know how much India sticks out, it's kind of like a big V that sticks out into the Indian Ocean. About halfway down is where Goa is. And then he's just kind of going through here and doing stuff, and he hears that there's a need down here, kind of around the Cape. And so he takes a ship, he's down there for a while. At one point he winds up going up here to, I can't remember what the name of the place is. It's in my notes, but it's the place where the Apostle Thomas went to. it was called Madras, is what it's called, was what it was called in that area, and now it's called Chennai, is the city that it's near. But there's actually, that's where St. Thomas's bones, is where his relics are, is in this cathedral. So he makes a pilgrimage up there. And so, but he winds up going back to Goa, and he's kind of spending time back and forth, you know, and they're rebuilding churches, and they're getting things set up, and they're bringing more priests in from Portugal. You know, he's writing letters back and forth, but again, if it takes 6 months by ship to get there, he writes a letter to the king, 6 months there, king writes a letter, 6 months back. You know, this isn't like you just, you know, call up FedEx and, you know, get my letter out to the king of Portugal. So they're getting instructions. He's being able to communicate, you know, as best they can. But it turns out that there's a need for, in another of the Portuguese colonies over at Malacca, which is in Indonesia. So again, if you can picture the map of Indonesia, there's that one peninsula that sticks way down, and then the island of Sumatra is right here. Malacca is kind of on that peninsula, right across from Sumatra. And so he goes there, and he spends about 4 months there. And again, he's kind of cleaning up the mess of what some of these other people did, and he's evangelizing. He uses the same tactic, right? He goes in there, and he's doing all this. He's just basically in his robe. He's barefoot. He's doing all this stuff. He's walking everywhere he goes, or he's taking a ship. And you know, he's just, you know, his charisma just draws people in. So he's there for 4 months in Malacca, and then for the next 18 months or so, they said he was just traveling around the different islands. They really didn't have a clear picture exactly where he was at that time. They had some pretty good ideas, but he spent about 1.5 years just going to different islands and just evangelizing and converting people to the faith. He wasn't there to strip them of their resources or anything like that. He's just there to spread the gospel. He just loved Jesus so much he wanted to do that. He winds up back in Malacca for 4 months, and then heads back to Goa for a time. But when he was in Malacca, he hears about this place called Japan. And it really wasn't known to the West very much at that time. And there was a guy who he was like a refugee from Japan. I don't remember why, but he was a refugee, and he had heard about, he and Francis connected, and so that's how Francis heard about Japan. And so when he was going back in, he's like, I want to go to Japan someday, and I want to connect with this guy, and we're going to go there, and we're going to convert people. So he does. So he winds up on another expedition. He heads back. They go back to Malacca. He picks up this guy it was like a Kiro or something like that, but he had converted during the time, and now he went by Paul. So he connects with him and a couple other priests, and they decide they're going to go up to Japan. Well, while he's en route, they're sailing, and a really bad storm comes up. And this, again, some people say it's a legend, some people say it's true. Nobody really knows. But while it's going on, he either loses his crucifix, is one story, it falls into the ocean, or somebody said that he felt like he could calm the storm if he threw his crucifix into the ocean, and the ocean supposedly got calm. So that's why I say it could be a legend. But anyway, he's without his crucifix. And so he's like, now I don't have my crucifix, what am I going to do? So he's praying to God, return my crucifix, please return my crucifix. So it said after the storm, they beached, and they were taking a respite and doing repairs. And he's sitting on the beach, and he said, and supposedly all of a sudden a crab walks up with his crucifix, gives it to him, and goes back in the ocean. Is it true? I don't know. You know, it's one of those things that's it's debated by theologians. It sounds really weird. Could God do it? Sure, God could do it. Stranger things have happened. But anyway, he winds up going to Japan. And so he winds up at a couple of places. I want to get the names of them right. I've got it in my notes here. He's kind of starting on the southwestern tip of Japan. And the place he starts at is, he starts at Kagoshima. And it's kind of on the southwest corner of all the islands of Japan. And so he starts there, and you know, he said, you know, they received him okay, but he wasn't very successful. He said after about a year, he had only done like 100 converts, and it was really unusual for him to have that problem. But he also said that the Japanese were very fine people. They had a lot of history, but he could tell. And so he said, it was going to be a harder task. He headed on to a place called Hirado, which is on that same island. I can't remember the Japanese islands. Maybe it's Kyushu? I can't remember. It's the southernmost island. And it's on the northern edge of that. He spent some time there. Really doesn't have any luck there. Goes up to Yamaguchi, which is I think it's on the bottom of Honshu. Goes there, and just still isn't having much luck. He's been trying, and they listen to him, but hardly anybody converts. And he decides he's going to go up to Kyoto, which is a fairly large city even at that time, and that's quite a ways away, but he makes it up there. It's not quite as far away as Tokyo is, but he goes up there, and he gets an audience with one of the leaders, and they just aren't listening to him. And he kind of realizes, and I don't know if he's told or if he realizes, but the tactics he was using were not going to work, because he was there in his tattered clothes and barefoot and all this kind of stuff. So at the next place, he went back to Yamaguchi. He goes back there and he gets some better clothes, and he gets everybody else with him, and they kind of present themselves better, and people start listening. And so there's something about the culture where we're more apt to listen to them if they presented themselves better, something like that. But anyway, they started having some success there, but it was still very limited. Eventually, what wound up happening is a lot of those people that converted to Christianity were martyred. And so there was just it was a very closed society in terms of converting people to Christianity. It was just too foreign to their way of thinking. So anyway, so he catches at one point he catches a ship back, and he goes back to India. And while he was in Japan, he heard about this other place called China. He says, I want to go to China. Well, China, even at that time, was a very closed country, and you couldn't get into China. So he was concocting this plan where they were going to sneak him in, and somebody was going to smuggle him in, and he was going to get in there, and he was going to do this. So this is their plan. And so from India, again, they head back to China. So this guy has got some frequent sailing miles going on. He's spent a significant amount of time on ship. And the funny thing is he gets seasick, but he still does it anyway. He's just really sick all the time. But he would go out there, and he would preach, and he would do mass on deck, and he was just sicker than a dog for a lot of it, but he still did it. So anyway, so he winds up going. They take him back. He goes through Malacca, where he's used to. They pick up some supplies and pick up people, and then they start heading up. They get to an island. I'll butcher its name, so I'm not even going to try it. They get to this one island, which is like 6 miles off the coast of China, and he starts there. And they set up a church, and he converts some people there, and they kind of set up a base of operations, and then they make their plans to go over to China. Well, while this is going on, it's getting later and later in the year, so it's like mid-November, and he catches a fever, and because he's like he is kind of living this life of poverty, so he'll sleep on the ground, on the bare ground in a hut or out in the open. And so he contracts this fever that just won't go away. So people wind up taking him into their home, but it's not much better because of the time of year. And a couple days before he was scheduled to go to China, he dies of the fever. He's 46 years old at the time. But as you can tell by his life, he's led a pretty full life. He's spent a lot of time on ships. He's converted a lot of people. He's faced a lot of adversity. He's had a lot of successes. But he dies like within view of where he really ultimately wants to go. And so you can see why he was made the patron saint of foreign missions, because they said outside of St. Paul, his travels were, and he covered more mileage than St. Paul, but they basically said he was the St. Paul of modern times because of the amount of traveling that he did and going different places. And so this was in 1552, I think, is when he died. He was canonized in 1622 along with St. Ignatius. They were both canonized at the same time. And I think somebody like Teresa of Avila, they were all canonized at the exact same time. So all these three Spaniards are all canonized at the same time. And so he, like I said, some people would say, that the people that were out spreading Christianity were bringing a lot of misery and things like that. He was not one of them. He was one that was actually trying to fix the things that were done as a result of some of the explorations and some of the colonization and things like that. So he really did a lot of good for Christianity, and he gets a lot of credit for it too. But there's a lot of things. Sometimes you can read things about him. They say there's a lot of legends that just kind of rose up about him, like he had the gift of tongues because he had to speak with all these people. But it said in the reading I did that he usually had an interpreter. He tried really hard to learn languages, but the languages were really hard for him. He did the best he could with it, though. But he usually had an interpreter with him. So again, sometimes these things over time kind of mutate into these legends about some of these saints. But he was always trying his hardest to reach whomever he could. But whenever he could, he would start with the children, he would spend time in the hospitals and the hospices and with the poor and evangelize them, knowing that if he could evangelize a lot of people, that they would see the results, and they would also start evangelizing as well. So the miracle, the wedding at Cana, the second of the Luminous Mysteries, the grace of the mystery is fidelity to Jesus through Mary. And so this idea of the devotion to Mary, you guys have all heard the analysis of this, I'm sure, that this is the proof that we are to pray for Mary's intercession, like the people that discovered there was no wine. They went to Mary and says, we're out of wine. And Mary goes to Jesus, says, they're out of wine. She doesn't tell Jesus, you got to do this. She just says, here's what's going on. And she leaves it up to Jesus. And so Jesus then performs his first miracle, through his mother's, intercession, if you will. And so this idea of fidelity to Jesus can come through Mary. And so most of the saints that you find, there was some saint, I don't know who it was, basically says very few people become saints without having a devotion to the mother of all saints, Mary. And that's true. So just like, anybody else I didn't mention in the talk, but Francis and Ignatius and all these guys had a deep devotion to Our Lady. And they would, they knew that she was the way to Jesus, was through her. And so it's really important that that this is a really good story to just kind of meditate on. And that one line, again, you guys have probably heard this before, where, Mary tells the servants, do whatever he tells you. That's a good line. If we listen to nothing else in the entire Bible and just listen to those words, do whatever he tells you, meaning do whatever Jesus tells you, we would do pretty well if we just followed that one line. And so I'm sure that's what Francis did. Francis had a very deep prayer life. He spent a lot of time in prayer, as did Ignatius. And you can bet that Francis learned Ignatius's spiritual practices, a little bit, which we did at the retreat, when we did the daily examen. But it was very powerful for them, and the Jesuits grew very quickly because this is something people were hungering for. And so you can bet that Mary was a big part of that as well. And so just really, just really find a way to incorporate Mary into your prayer life. It doesn't necessarily have to be praying a full rosary. It could just be saying Hail Marys or Memoraries. Memoraries are at least as good, if not better, than Hail Marys. But start praying little bits of the rosary. We've talked about that too. But just find a way to incorporate Mary into your prayer life. You will not go wrong if you do that.